Hi everyone, this is Shivani, and today we're going to discuss about the doctrine of severability under the Constitution of India. So, with the adoption of the Constitution of India in the year 1950, Part 3 in the form of fundamental rights also came into effect. Fundamental rights, what are those? Fundamental rights are a set of inherent rights which guarantees to every citizen of this country right of dignified existence and holistic all-round development. Now, the doctrine of severability, it derives its validity from Article 13. What does Article 13 state? All laws in force in India before the commencement of Constitution, insofar as inconsistent with the provisions of fundamental rights, shall to that extent of inconsistency be void. As an extension of Article 13, the doctrine states that when some particular provision of the statute infringes or violates the fundamental rights, but the provision is severable, which is separable from the rest of the statute, and then only that provision will be declared void by the courts and not the entire statute, which means this doctrine lays down that if violative and non-violative provisions are separated in a way that non-violative provisions can exist without the violative provision, then the non-violative provisions will be upheld as valid and enforceable. So, what does this mean? It means that if there are two kinds of provisions, violative and non-violative provisions, what are these violative and non-violative provisions? What do they violate or do not violate? And if they are violative of fundamental rights under Part 3 of the Constitution of India, then in such a case, any provision which is violative of the fundamental rights will be, and if it can be separated from the rest of the statute, then that provision which can be separated from the rest of the provision will be held as unenforceable and violative, and the rest of the provision which is not violative of Part 3 of the Constitution, that is not violative of the fundamental rights, cannot be, will be upheld as valid and enforceable. Doctrine of severability cases. So, let us deal with some of the important cases through which doctrine of severability came into existence in India. One of the earliest instances of using the doctrine was the case of Nordenfeldt versus Maxim Nordenfeldt Guns and Ammunition Company in the year 1876. In this case, the court struck down the violative portion of a contract but held that the rest of the contract could go ahead after severing the violative portion. What is the meaning of severing? Severing is to separate or to remove or set aside a particular portion from the the rest of the document, the rest of the act, the rest of the statute. In this particular case, the portion that was held to be violative of the Contract Act was severed from the rest of the Contract Act and was struck down and held as void, was held as violative of the law, whereas the rest of the contract was upheld. The doctrine of severability was discussed at length in the case of RMDC versus the state of Bombay, and the court laid down a few principles which are to be followed till date when talking about the doctrine of severability. In order to find out whether the valid part of a statute can be separated from the invalid part, the intention of the legislature is the determining factor. When the statute had come into force, when the statute had been implemented, what was the intention of the legislature behind implementing that particular statute, that particular law is to be taken into consideration when finding out the validity of the statute. In case the valid and the non-valid parts of the statutes are inseparable, then it will invariably result in the invalidity of the entire statute. First, we are going to see whether certain parts of the statute can be separated from the rest of the statute or not. If those parts can be separated and set aside from the rest of the statutes, then in such a case the doctrine of severability applies. Because independent of separation, if the rest of the act survives, then this doctrine applies. However, if after the separation, the rest of the act does not survive in itself, then in such a case the entire act would be held invalid and would be void and unenforceable. When the statute stands independently After the invalid portion is struck down, then it will be upheld, notwithstanding that the rest of the statute has become unenforceable. The only part which becomes unenforceable and can be separated is the part which is severed from the rest of the doctrine. In such a case, that is the part that is held to be violative and is not upheld. The rest of the statute in itself is upheld. In cases where the valid and invalid parts are separable, but both of them were intended to be part of the same scheme, then the whole scheme will be invalid. In case where even though the sin doctrine, even though the statute survives after the separable part, but in order for the doctrine to second part of the doctrine to survive, the first part is essential, the severed part is essential. Then in such a case, the entire doctrine then collapses and will be held as invalid. There may be instances where the valid and invalid parts are separable and not part of the same scheme. However, invalidating the valid part leaves the rest too thin and truncated, then also it will be invalidated as a whole. Severability is to be determined by reading the statute as a whole and not the specific provisions or parts, which means to determine whether the statute can be separated from the invalid part can be separated from the valid part. We need to go through the entire statute to understand how this particular provision is linked to the rest of the statute and what importance that provision which is to be severed holds. In order to find the legislative intent behind the statute, it will be legitimate to take into account the history, the object, the title, and the preamble of the a particular act that had come into existence, which makes us understand whether the reason why we are severing the rest of the provisions from the provisions which are non-violative is actually mandatory to be severed or not. Another important case that came into existence after this particular case is A.K. Gopalan versus State of Madras. The court found that Section 14 of the Preventive Detention Act is to be violative of Article 14 of the Constitution. The court added that striking down Section 14 will not change the object of the Act, and thus only the impugned provision will be struck down and not the Act as a whole. A very similar observation was also made in the case of D.S. Nakara versus Union of India. In the case of State of Bombay versus F.N. Balsara, it was held that the violative provisions of the Bombay Prohibition Act of 1949 does not affect the validity of the entire act, and thus there is no need to invalidate the entire statute altogether, but only invalidate parts of the statute which are violative of the fundamental rights. The Supreme Court declared that Sections 4 and 55 of the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act as invalid for being beyond the amending powers of the Constitution, but held that the rest of the Amendment Act was valid. In Quixote Holifan versus Zakilu, the court held the validity of the 10th schedule while striking down its paragraph 7 to be violative of the provisions of Article 368, Clause 2. Now, in conclusion, the doctrine of severability, it opens up the way for the applicability of judicial review. This is because the courts through judicial review invalidate the laws which infringe upon the fundamental rights of the individuals. When an individual states or contends that a particular legislation is taking away his or her fundamental rights and invokes the court's right for judicial review of that decision, the burden of proof lies on the person alleging that, which means the burden of proof lies on him or her for proving how that particular impugned legislation has interfered or inferred against his or her rights. The doctrine of severability is a principle of great importance in the Indian Constitution. It is it is a touchstone against which the validity of the laws is tested. It is a check on unfettered powers of the legislature if left on its own and capability of going rogue and invalidating the basic fundamental rights guaranteed to the individuals. Which is why it is important to note that through the power of judiciary, the executive remains in check. Thus, through the doctrine of severability and judicial review confirmed by such doctrines, The scope of the judiciary widens on to check onto the powers of the executive so as to it not going or violating the rights of the citizens and against their fundamental rights. The doctrine of severability means that when some particular provision of a statute offends or is against the constitutional limitation, but that provision is severable from the rest of the statute, only that offending provision will be declared as void and not the entire statute. Therefore, this doctrine applies only in those cases where such a provision can be separated from the rest of the provision and the rest of the provision survives the intent, the aim, the object of the, the preamble of the provision sustains without the existence of the provision that is to be severed. So this was what we had learned about the doctrine of severability. Thank you.